Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for our webcast, Strengthening Our Democracy, Insights from Tribal Democracy Project. My name is Danielle Moser, and I'll be your MC for tonight. I'm the Wildlife Program Manager for Oregon Wild, and I'm honored to introduce our very special guest. Brian Smith is a citizen of the Muskogee Nation, is a campaign consultant that has worked in electoral politics in Oregon since 2006. His focus on Native and other people of color candidates and his belief that institutional reform is necessary to truly empower Native and other marginalized communities inspired him to join Jalen Suppa in co-founding the Tribal Democracy Project. Alish is Jalen Suppa's Indian name given to her by her namesake and grandmother, Margaret Suppa. She is a citizen of the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs and a descendant of the Yakama Nation, Shoshone, Bannock, and Cree. Jalen is a mother of two school-age children, an educator, and an advocate for social justice, for equitable education and equitable representation. She was raised on the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs Reservation in the northern part in a community called Simnasho, Oregon. She is a traditional food gatherer for her tribe and a consultant that works to center and empower tribal sovereignty and tribal nations and people. And I hear that she's running a little bit behind because she's actually in a tribal council committee meeting. So she will be joining us momentarily. I appreciate their Brian and Jalen joining us for this webcast and providing an opportunity for our audience to listen and learn about the important work they're doing to ensure we have a more equitable, inclusive, and representative democracy, and especially and specifically with tribal nations and communities. The history of tribes in Oregon is complex and nuanced and includes colonial legacies and wrongdoings like forced removal that have long-standing and current impacts. It is important to not only acknowledge Indigenous people who have lived here since time immemorial and the land on which Indigenous peoples live today, but continue to do meaningful work by supporting them in the present, respecting and uplifting tribal sovereignty and taking action. So I appreciate you two both being here to help deepen our understanding and sharing with us actions and other things that we can do to ensure there's a more just and representative future. If you're interested in watching this webcast again or want to share it widely with family and friends, which we recommend, we will have a recording of this program, which will be emailed out this week, and it will also be posted on our website, oregonwild.org, in the Wild blog section. We will take questions and have answers, of course, at the end of the presentation. So please just pop those in the Q&A section throughout the presentation. We usually get a flood of questions kind of right at the end of the presentation. So the sooner you get them in, the easier it is for me to organize and so we can get them answered. And then finally, please don't forget to RSVP for our next webcast, which is on March 6th. And it's about the future of fire and fire policy, featuring Ryan Reed, who is an Indigenous fire practitioner from the Karuk, Hupa, and Yurok tribes of Northern California, and Tim Inglesby, who is the executive director of FUSI, which is Firefighters United for Safety, Ethics, and Ecology. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can share yours, Brian, and we can get started. And hopefully Jalen will join us soon. And
I'll hold off on sharing those slides until we get to that part of the discussion, just so
okay.
it's a distraction for folks to read those. So first, I guess Tribal Democracy Project, I'll kind of give an introduction to its brand new organization, why we exist, and kind of what led to that. And so Jalen and I co-founded the organization in technically we started about a year ago, but it was what kind of inspired us to start this organization were experiences working together in a couple of different formats in the political arena. One of them was the 2021 special district elections in Jefferson County. So Warm Springs, the reservations in Jefferson County, and folks from that tribal community, their kids go to school in the school district in the Jefferson, and then and also a lot of the other special districts like Parks and Rec, Education Service District, that kind of thing. Um, Jalen was running for office, and I came on board because that's my experiences in electoral politics, was to run her campaign. And she decided to actually facilitate a campaign for a slate of candidates of women from Warm Springs. There were four of them in all to run for different spots. Um, and the if anybody from that area knows Jefferson County, it's a very conservative area, but also it's very diverse. So the school in the Jefferson 509J school district itself, about 70% of the kids are BIPOC. So roughly a third Native, roughly a third from the Latinx community there. But at that point, there was only one out of the five school board directors who were from one of those communities. So there are huge issues with equitable representation in these areas. And it's real chronic disenfranchisement with Native voters, which shows in the precinct returns there. The Native precincts on the reservation underperform all other precincts in the county. A large number of non-affiliated voters, relatively speaking. I know that's a common feature everywhere, but kind of a lot of institutional features that these folks were up against. But Jalen's campaign, like the slate of candidates, uh, she kind of built this campaign with a very aggressive get out the vote. It was very data centered and highly analytical on my end as far as voter targeting. And then we kind of also introduced this model of networking and outreach where basically the organizers who happen to be the candidates in this case were from the community, worked within the community, and a high degree of trust. Um, the end result was that although Jalen didn't win, she lost by about 55 votes. And we're talking about in a very politicized school board environment, right? Particularly for progressive candidates. But two of the four candidates did win their seats. And also on Warm Springs, voters turned out at three times the amount that was expected. To put that into context, the Warm Springs precincts, there are two of them, outperformed every precinct in Jefferson County. Almost every precinct in Central Oregon, and probably I would say top, I didn't run the numbers, but probably top 5% statewide for special district election. And they overperformed basically every electoral format except for the 2020 general presidential year general election. But they got pretty close to that. So we felt like, okay, we've got a good system going that we should refine. But it's tough to do using a typical political action committee model to raise the money to do that. So that was one component. The next one was we immediately went to work on redistricting in 2021, where Jalen worked to facilitate testimony from tribal communities in the state of Oregon. And my job was to basically draw a congressional and legislative map. So the congressional map, you just draw six districts. With the legislative map, you have to draw 60 House districts. And the rules are you just can't draw a map for your community of interest. You have to submit a map which fits all the criteria to the legislature on their platform with all 60 districts. So we did all of that and worked on testimony for tribal communities. And unfortunately, the end result was that the state of Oregon was the first in the nation for that year to racially gerrymander multiple tribal communities. And the legislature signed off by the governor. So these two experiences, um, working in tribal communities, how do we empower them? Electoral reforms are a feature. So after that racial gerrymandering, I think Warm Springs had there was an opportunity, at least the map we drew, to get a legislative district where someone from Warm Springs could actually win, right? If you respected communities of interest, there's a possibility to get a legislator from one of Oregon's tribes, which, to my knowledge, hasn't happened yet. We have a couple of natives who are elected to office, but they're not from any of the tribes from Oregon. These two experiences kind of made us realize, like, okay, there's a better approach to do this, and there's also a need, and hence we formed Tribal Democracy Project. We're currently fiscally sponsored by Common Cause and working to get our C3 and C4 status. Um, so basically, our overall mission, philosophy, I mean, our mandates, they're pretty broad and ambitious, but we're starting with a couple of projects I'll allude to. But our goal there is basically to enfranchise tribal community and native voters, right, throughout the state, just to start with. Um, and really quick before I get into that, I see Jalen might be on, and maybe do a quick. We did an introduction for her. I don't know if she wants to say hi really quick.
Hi, Jalen.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. No, you had a committee meeting run long, so we really do appreciate you taking your time to be with us. Brian had just kind of gone over the history and the founding of Tribal Democracy Project, and yeah, but I would love to. We kind of did intros and I did your introduction so folks are aware of you and your background, but look forward to hearing from you. And as I told the audience, we will collect questions from them and leave some time at the end to ask you both from the audience. But thank you again both so much for being here. And Brian, I'll kick it back to you.
So the immediate goals for Tribal Democracy Project, first off, civics education within tribal communities, and what does that look like, right? And this kind of goes into our philosophy of electoral reforms and of empowerment in general. But that civics education within communities for things in the future, whether it's get out the vote or just building a fundamental knowledge base. And the philosophy behind that and with our organization overall is to prioritize tribal sovereignty and the importance and the understanding that tribal sovereignty is the key to empower tribal communities and to make these really make these communities better off, right? Another component is electoral reforms. Um, like I might have stated before, or didn't, we think that a lot of the issues affecting Native voters, tribal community voters, are institutional in nature. A lot of the disenfranchisement has to do with a great deal of distrust in the system, which is completely warranted in our view. And so the other component is what are the electoral reforms that we want to take a look at, which can help address a lot of these issues coming from the other side, right? Um, and then also in the long run, we want to kind of look at how do we train folks to get ready for these systems if they're going to go into politics in the future, with training of candidates, building their support networks. It's one thing to get elected, but once you're there, what are the support networks, right? So these are the kind of the features that we want to look at. And so that being said, kind of the philosophy of Tribal Democracy Project, uh, I think we want to talk about sovereignty a little bit. So I'm going to hand it over to Jay Lynn because I think this is a good time to talk about kind of the discussion of ceded lands. And I'll leave it to you, Jay Lynn, on that.
All right. Thank you, Brian. And again, I'm so sorry that I'm late. But I also think it's a very timely and appropriate of why I'm late. So when our tribal government says you're presenting, and you usually have no say so in when that's going to be and how long it's going to take. And so I was, so I'm sorry that I am late. Glad I can make it though. I'm glad they moved us up in the agenda so I could get out of there in time to get back here. So with that said, so I actually run a series that teaches outside organizations about the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs. So I am a member of the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, which I'm sure you all heard. And we have ceded lands, that it's a very large area. And a lot of folks are actually not aware of the ceded lands, which is a treaty right for us. We can hunt and fish and gather our plants and our foods and do all the things that we usually do, that we have done on the reservation, but that extends to the ceded lands. Now that does bump up against various laws, and it bumps up against county, it bumps up against private landowners, it bumps up against city limits. And it's really complicated. It's not very simple, but to me, it's very simple. We have treaty rights that include ceded lands, and those are our rights to be able to do what we need to do in order for us to continue to carry our ways in, whether that's fishing or gathering our roots or picking our berries or going out for our plant medicines that we use still to this day. And so I wanted to drop a link in the chat of our ceded lands for you all to see. Let me try to find the image. Um, and you know, it's really hard to discuss this in a very short time frame, which is why I offer a 3-part series in this. And this is, you know, I'm putting a plug in if you are interested in learning more about what sovereignty means to the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs and how to have better partnerships with tribal nations, and it includes tribal consultation. And I do go over the map. We look at the map, and just for reference, because I can't pull it up right now. Ceded lands runs from the Columbia River all the way down past Sun River, which is outside of Bend. I'm not sure where everybody's from today. And then it comes over little past Sisters, and then all the way over to it runs over to like Morrow, and so way over in John Day. And so
I shared it's probably a broader map, Jalen, but I just shared one. I don't know if that's helpful to give folks some context, or if you can point that out on this map in particular, but if not, I can take it down.
I can try to work with this one. So our ceded land, so you can see the Confederate Tribes of Warm Springs right there. That's kind of in the it's, I don't know if you guys probably can't see my thing, but so it runs all the way over close to the, let's see, where is the Oregon? Because that says Colville. So this looks like a language map. I think that's what this is. This is showing kind of where our languages run in our territories. And with our treaty, you know, we signed our treaty, and that included the ceded lands. And part of that was the ceded lands does cover the areas of which we used to move with. And my tribe, so tribes is still a colonial concept. So when you're talking about the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, that is 3 tribes within the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs. And then even within that, though, I am Warm Springs. So you have Warm Springs, Wasco, and Paiute. And I'm primarily Warm Springs. I do have Wasco, but I was raised in Warm Springs. We had bands. We had bands prior to becoming a confederated tribe. And so with that, my family, so bands were like family units. They were smaller. And so when you look at our treaty, you'll see multiple signatures. You won't see just 3. You'll see multiple signatures because there was multiple bands that covered this vast area that we now call Oregon. And we had folks that were on that side of the river, on the north side of Columbia, the Columbia River. And so I have family up in that are enrolled in Yakima. I have family that's enrolled over in Pendleton in the Umatilla area, because it depended on where you were at along the river when we were put onto reservations. And my family, you know, we followed the foods. So we followed the seasons of the food. So when we were fishing and hunting, a lot of times we were at the river. And then we would move down to the John Day area, in that area, to gather our roots. And then we would move on back up towards the Mount Hood area to gather our berries. And, you know, so we kind of made this huge circle, and our ceded lands actually really lines up really well with where we gathered our foods and how we moved throughout the seasons. So I'm gonna look for the image. I have it in my presentation, but so I'm not used to having to look it up somewhere. But I want to drop it in there because I do think it's really important that you see, because there's so many people that are not aware of ceded lands. And when you see it, a lot of people are really surprised. And I don't know, I'm just going to drop it in here, and then whoever can drop it in the chat for the folks that are, because I know we're in webinar, so I'm not sure if that can go to everybody. So I dropped it in the chat, and I would ask you to take time to look at that map to see, you know, depending on where you're at, it is a very large area that just one tribe, now mind you, this is one tribe, are ceded lands. And so, as you're thinking about the tribes that are near you, what do they have ceded lands? What are their ceded lands? What is within their treaty rights? Are you respecting those treaty rights? Are you uplifting those treaty rights? Yes, there you go. Thank you. Yes. So yeah, so
sorry, took me a minute, but I got it up. There you
it's
go.
okay. Thank you so much. So this is the ceded lands. This is, again, one tribe, Confederate Tribes of Warm Springs. This is our ceded lands. The pink, you see the pink, that's the reservation boundaries. Everything, there's a brown line around, and you can see it. That's all the ceded lands for the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs. And there are places that it could intersect with other tribes because, we were moving around based off foods. We weren't moving around based off of who was where. We were moving for survival for our foods. And so you can see it goes all the way up to the Columbia River. It goes down past Bend, and I think it's kind of the Sun River area, and then over to like the John Day area, those rural areas, and then just over there by Sisters is the edge. And so I think I'll stop there because I don't know how much time I have, but I'm glad you're able to see the map. You can also just Google ceded lands, Warm Springs, Oregon, and this map will come up. It should be the first one. And also just think about who's closest to you. Are you close to Siletz? Are you close to Umatilla? Are you close to Burns? Or are you close to Klamath? And ask yourselves, what is their ceded lands? Do they have ceded lands? What are their treaty rights? And start thinking about who's close to you all in the terms of trying to make sure that you're respecting tribal nations and their ceded lands and their sovereign rights.
Thank you, Jalen. Brian, I don't know if let me know when you want to share your screen and I can unshare mine.
That'll be coming up soon. I guess I'll jump into the part on the electoral reform aspect of what we're trying to do. And so first, I think it's important to talk about our lens and philosophy. So first and foremost, we think when it comes to electoral reforms for tribal communities, tribal sovereignty is the fundamental value, and meaning consultation, if not a seat at the table for tribes, however that looks. I understand that can get very complicated with 9 different tribes for anything, but it is that value that kind of drives, meaning is when they reform at the ground level, when folks are putting some together, are they working with tribes from the beginning? To whatever execution looks like and whatever commission looks like, do tribes have a seat at the table or input, right? So there's that underlying value as our lens. Another lens for any electoral reform has to be a lens of racial equity. And what I mean by that is that there has to be a recognition that with disenfranchised populations, and not just Native communities, we're talking about all disenfranchised populations, marginalized communities, other BIPOC communities, younger voters, working class voters. There needs to be a recognition that a lot of that disenfranchisement, if not all of it, has to do with the way the systems are in place. So when we're looking at an equitable reform, it has to recognize that and not perpetuate it, and kind of kick the can down the road. And that's important. And I can bring that up in the context of redistricting here in just a little bit. So, and Jalen, feel free to jump in if I'm missing something on that. That being said, we can't immediately. We have two main projects we're working on related to electoral reforms. We can't do them all. I mean, for instance, one of them that's going to be absent from this conversation is, for instance, open primaries. I think those are super important for disenfranchised voters, right? And if that gets on the ballot, everybody, I think, should be voting for that. It is unfair that the plurality of voters are paying for a closed primary system that they don't get to vote in, and those choices are not there for them. But that won't be in our discussion today. The reforms we're currently focusing on are redistricting reform, and then ranked choice, more specifically proportional ranked choice voting. So I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add in at this point, Jillian, or you wanted to wait.
We had some questions in the chat, and I don't know if we want to answer those now or are we going to answer those at the end?
We typically wait till the end and just do them all together. I'm recording them on a document I have, and so we'll have them all ready to go.
Perfect. Thank you.
So redistricting reform, as I mentioned at the beginning, our work in redistricting is one of the things that kind of moved us to form this organization. Um, and so, okay, what does equitable redistricting reform look like? So first and foremost, we do have a value system, and that has to do with tribal input. As I mentioned before, multiple tribal communities, Warm Springs was one of them, Klamath Tribes was another, racially gerrymandered. What that means is that a community of interest um, uh, of a certain group is cut right in half, right? Or basically the power of their vote is diluted at some point. In the case of Warm Springs, um, the reservation was cut off from the city of Madras, where folks work, where they go to school, and also roughly a quarter of their tribal citizens live. In Klamath Falls, it was even more extreme, where it was cut about 60-40, right? So that's essentially racial gerrymandering. So with redistricting, uh, what we wanted to get to the bottom of, like, okay, what is the best kind of reform, or what's a better approach for tribal communities? And in this context, there is a measure up called IP 14, which is trying to get on the ballot. And it's kind of put forth by people, not politicians. So this is going to sound weird. We're against this IP 14, and I'm going to get into why. Um, let's go. I'm going to go ahead and share slides now.
And I'll just jump in and say, Brian briefly talked about tribal consultation, and as we get into why we're against IP 14, it can be used as an example of how tribal consultation was not prioritized, and also as an example of what are the impacts when tribal nations aren't consulted with, and how that impacts tribal nations in the state of Oregon.
So first I'm going to get into a report that was commissioned by Common Cause last summer. And the background behind that is that they had a couple of interns over the summer looking for a research project. And then Common Cause reached out to me, and this is a great organization, by the way. They're our fiscal sponsors. Um, it like, hey, is there anything that's on your plate that you think is necessary?
I think you unshared you had shared your screen and then unshared it, so I didn't know if you were wanting to have your screen shared right now.
Here we go.
There we are. And then just, yeah, play from current slide or whatever.
Let's get that on there. And let's see. Sorry, my view of the top is being blocked.
I think going to the left with your cursor and play from start.
Yeah, okay. So Common Cause set up a research project doing a qualitative and quantitative analysis with a couple of interns on basically investigating what is the best form of redistricting commissions, which are most advantageous to tribal communities throughout the country. So qualitative, meaning they were conducting interviews with folks who were involved in redistricting in multiple different states. And quantitative, whether it's applying things like racially polarized analysis and some statistical tools to say, okay, was there racial gerrymandering after the fact? So that report is pretty much completed, and I think will be publicized hopefully in the near future, but we've basically got the Cliff Notes version of this. So this kind of goes through the methods that I talked about. So there are 12 plus interviews with folks, leaders and organizers in Native communities, landscape analysis. I mentioned the racially polarized voting analysis. Second. The goals, impact of recent redistricting cycle on Native communities. We're talking about the 2020 redistricting in 2021. Want to get at what are the policy reforms that support fair Native representation and best practices to guide future redistricting organizing. So the findings after in the report, first one, and I think this is pretty well known, the census undercounts. There were a lot of data releases that this did have a negative impact on Native communities. Um, Weakening of voting rights acts, right, at the Supreme Court level. But then number three, and now we're talking about the impact specifically for Native communities. Across the country, organizers were shut out of the redistricting process across a lot of states, and I can speak to a little bit about Oregon potentially. Lack of transparency, right? Restricted access to public input on maps, superficial outreach, broadband access, insufficient funding for community-based organizations. So a lot of the stuff nationwide didn't necessarily apply to Oregon, but that bottom one is definitely a big one as far as funding community-based organizations like us. And then policies we'll get into that respect tribal sovereignty, improve the process for Native communities. That's important. Before we get into the recommendations, well, let's go through this first. We want to resource Native-led organizing early and often, meaning this is every 10 years, right? So from our perspective, the organizing has to happen in communities well before that. And that's where Jalen will have an opportunity to kind of talk about her current project on Warm Springs. Then we talk about ensuring a timely census that's accurate. Number three is the big point. And remember, this is coming from not only Common Cause and us, but also the National Congress of American Indians, who oversaw this research. Recognize tribal sovereignty and legally enshrine the following in redistricting processes. Conduct extensive outreach to tribal nations with regard to physical, digital, and language accessibility. Facilitate and provide resources for a process that give tribal nations the option of selecting at least one redistricting commissioner. If tribal nations choose to forego option B, require a representative from tribal nations in the decision-making room and/or require tribal nations input as to the selection of the redistricting commissioners. So that part is the big piece. And then going back to the current measure that People Not Politicians is working to get on the ballot. So we had a lot of interaction with these folks, I believe in, what was it, earlier in 2022, so almost 2 years ago where it started. And there's a lot to get into, but the approach essentially is we met with them. It's like, hey, the current way you've structured your reform is problematic for two key reasons. Because they're going around, you're asking for tribal government support. You're asking support from our organization after this thing was actually drafted, rather than the process of if you're going to respect sovereignty, you should be working hard to get input from tribal governments, tribal communities. It's not to say that that is always possible, but you have to make an attempt at that, right? To start from the beginning if you want someone to get behind it. The other issue is in the outcome of the product. If you're looking at these recommendations, and like I said, these recommendations came from studying this after this scenario took place. But it was definitely something we thought was important even at that time, is that if you're going to have any kind of redistricting commission, there needs to be tribal input into the selection of that process. And if possible, to respect tribal sovereignty as other co-equal governments, right? So tribal citizens are unique in that we're both, citizens of the federal and state governments, but also our tribes, right? And those governments. So in this process, tribes should have the option of having at least one commissioner that is a voting commissioner in any sort of redistricting commission. The other issue, which isn't on here, that we took it that was problematic, is the way commissioners are selected. And there's a voting filter on there. It's highly discriminatory, not just to tribal communities, but to people of color in general, marginalized communities in general, and also non-affiliated voters. The other issue, which I think might resonate with this audience, is who is actually behind IP14. We were actually having good discussions with the folks from the League of Women Voters, but when it came to the aspects of tribal sovereignty, they couldn't move on that, and they deferred us to who we think the folks were calling the shots, and that was the Oregon Farm Bureau. We met with a couple of their reps. There was a lot of basically racist language in the whole discussion. And it was a hard no on respecting tribal sovereignty in any kind of product. So that kind of turned us off to this. And so for these number of reasons, and like I said, after this, we got the results from this report. We decided to come out against IP14. So as a result, we submitted a resolution to the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians for the Winter Convention last month. And in that resolution, I think it was a unanimous vote, if I'm not mistaken. We supported basically these recommendations, but also said IP14 is not the way to go on that. So, and I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that for redistricting, Jalen.
No, I think just emphasizing that tribes do need to be, and and it's in the first one, they need early and often. And that's not just with Native-led organizers, that's also with tribal nations. We need to make sure that we are consulting and building relationships with tribal nations sooner rather than later. And we shouldn't be bringing folks on after the fact. And that was our experience, being brought in after the fact to provide input and feedback into the process. However, I will say, we are a Native-led organization, and really, we were trying to empower them to actually go to the nations themselves, because that's who they should be going for. Because I can't speak on behalf of the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs. I'm a tribal member, and I can speak to my experience as a tribal member, but I can't speak on behalf of my tribe, and nobody can, unless you're in an elected position within our tribal government. And that is our chiefs or our tribal councilmen and women. And so if anybody tells you that, they do not have the authority to. And so you have to make sure that you're ensuring that you're going through the proper chains and processes when it comes to tribal nations. And I would never speak on I can speak on what's best for my tribal nation and my perspective as a tribal member and the work that I've done here. However, I can't say that tribal nations would that they should be doing it this way and recommend that to someone and say this is what's best for them. I can give them guidance and I can give them the feedback, but then I would also say, but you need to talk to the tribal nation themselves so that they can have their official feedback and opinion on what you should do based off of that one tribal nation. And you can't lump them all together either. And in this experience, it was a rough experience. I'll just leave it at that.
I noticed I was a little vague on when I make the claim that it's their current commission, the way they select it or would propose to select it's discriminatory. That's powerful language. So I need to tell you why where that's coming from. So when you have just one case, like when you have a voting criteria, the first thing that pops up is there are a lot of Latino communities with folks who are working to become naturalized citizens, who work, they're on, the PTA or do different things like that. They have ways of being involved in the community. They would not have the ability to serve on this commission. And also when I mentioned you have to, when you're viewing equitable forms through a lens of equity, and you look at why are folks disenfranchised in the first place, like that disenfranchisement is baked in the system. That's why they don't have a certain voting record. So when we're looking at just non-affiliated voters, they're less likely to vote. They're younger. There's a reason for that, right? And so to not address that issue first, like I said, there are a number of things problematic when you have this lens. Also, other criteria as far as your involvement in politics, and I'll give you an example. Under IP14, if that were to pass, so for instance, legislative maps that were submitted, right, to the state of Oregon. I was one of, I think, two people outside of anybody in the legislature drawing maps who submitted a map. There's not a lot of expertise in that. Under their criteria, I would not be allowed to sit on a commission that focuses on drawing maps. If you look at, they just did a redistricting for city council in Portland, right, for their new voting system where they split it into, I think, 4 zones. If you look at the folks on that commission, given what their backgrounds are in politics, and there's a lot of young people, people of color, and I suspect most of them would not be allowed to sit on this commission. And they did a really good job, by the way, drawing those maps in Portland, I think. So that is what I mean by it's like, hey, this is actually a discriminatory process. And it should be known that in other parts of the country, I was just at a redistricting uh, event down in Los Angeles, I think in December, and that's something a lot of people talked about. Where this is a problem if you include it in your redistricting commissions, where you have to have a voting record and you eliminate large segments of the population because of that. That is an issue. So those are other problems I think that we have with IP14. No. Okay. I want Jalen to kind of talk about her workshop series a little bit. So really, I'm going to address ranked choice voting, but briefly. I think so. As folks might know, HB 2004 passed the legislature last time around. So now on the ballot at the state level this November, we'll have the opportunity to vote it into place, which means if it succeeds, ranked choice voting will be at the state level for federal and statewide positions. And for us, when it comes to reform that works to enfranchise Native voters, tribal community voters, all marginalized communities, there are a lot of good reforms out there, but this one has a very good track record nationwide, and with folks being very satisfied with the process, and it does work to get folks from communities of color elected, and that's why we like this reform. But more importantly, as a part of this legislation, so proportional ranked choice voting, which is a form of ranked choice voting for commissions, councils, multi-member districts, right? It is actually already legal. Portland is going to do this, right? They passed this. They're going to be doing this November. What HB 2004 does is that it kind of makes the process easier for localities to do that if they want, where the Secretary of State would basically have a template and facilitate the process so it's much easier. So I don't want to take too much time into that because that's something that we're also working on in the future at the local community level. But next, I want to talk about, or I'd like Jalen to talk about the workshop series, which is maybe the biggest component of what we're doing right now. So,
Thank you. So through my experience working on census, running for school board, and working on redistricting, I'm sure Brian talked about our history and how we kind of came to be. Through all of those experiences, though, it also really highlighted for me the amount of work that I need to do in my community as far as education and awareness and leadership development and understanding how we as a tribal nation and a tribal government, how we operate and how that then how we operate and work with whether it's the city, the county, the state, or the federal government. And so, and I learned that, a lot of folks don't, because it's a system that wasn't built for us and we're not included. And I see a lot of the questions in the chat asking about like where, the us, when is the consultation supposed to happen and when do we come to the table? And I think what I'm trying to do with this is really build up community leaders and folks that understand our own government first and foremost. And then how does that then play with the state? How does that relationship work with the county? And so, and my belief is because I've worked in the community on the ground, we don't have enough folks that truly understand or have even really thought about what does our treaty say? What does our constitution say? What are our bylaws? Who are on our committees? And, again, back to like, this is all in my series. I've been doing this for a few years, teaching about what the structure is of the Confederate Tribes of Warm Springs and how we operate and how you can have a better relationship with that tribal nation. And so I titled it Sovereignty in Action, and it's going to be going over the history of the U.S. and how we came to be. It's going to talk about specifically the Confederate Tribes of Warm Springs history. And then we're going to talk about treaty and look at the treaty, read the treaty, and look at ceded lands. And we're going to talk about the Constitution and bylaws. And we're going to talk about what sovereignty means. And then we're going to get into our way of life, talking about our cultural identity, which also can bump up against our political identity, and talk about our rights and responsibilities as individuals within our tribal nations. What are our rights and responsibilities if you're at the tribal council level? And then what is our rights and responsibilities as committees if you're serving on a committee? And then just what is our rights and responsibilities as a tribal nation in this country? And I'm really super excited for this because I think this is going to be beneficial not only to my community, but I think folks on the outside of our community, but my focus is my community because I want to grow leaders. I want to grow aware individuals who are civically engaging and understanding how this impacts us. And we do have a low voting turnout, not only in our tribal elections, but in any election, really. And we know where that comes from. That comes from the distrust, and that comes from not feeling heard, and all of those things. And then there's a lot of voter suppression, and so just trying to do my part in it. And it really does connect to us making sure that in the census, in redistricting, in whatever we are involved in, that we understand our role and we understand our ability to ensure that tribal sovereignty is being upheld and being respected by anybody that we're working with.
So I think I'm pretty sure we hit it all on the topics we wanted to. So I don't know, Danielle, you had like a question and answer. I know there were a bunch of questions
Yes, we have several. Yeah, we got lots of questions. So thank you so much to you both. That was really wonderful and helpful overview of all the incredible and important work you are doing. So let's I'm trying to organize here. Maybe go a little bit last to first, but one person asked, are you familiar with the governor's task force on tribal consultation? And curious what their membership and mandate is, or just kind of the guiding principles, I guess, for that consultation.
Did we answer, Brian? I am not familiar with the governor's task force. I'm assuming this has something to do with Shana Radford's new position that was put in place. And I don't know what that membership or mandate looks like. Again, because I am outside of the tribal nation's government structure. So I actually just resigned from education committee. So I wasn't actually elected an official as of my duties ended last Monday. I have too much on my plate. But if I was still on that committee, I probably would have more knowledge. And that's, that is, for me, that's an internal breakdown of communication, of not knowing, because I'm not a part of the government. I'm not hired and working for the government. And so I don't know that information. And I would, that's going to be a hard one because you're going to be bringing nine tribes, and I don't know how they're structuring that, because we also have like Celilo Village, who's not a federally recognized tribe, but they're a tribal community who has tribal members that are living there. And they chose not to leave, and they chose not to sign any treaty with nobody yet. So they miss out on a lot of services, and a lot of times they're not at the table. And so there's also those types of questions that I would have of who's representing all of the various tribal communities, because there's 9 tribes, but you also have, like an example, Celilo, who should probably be included in those discussions. But long answer, but I'm not familiar with it. I'm gonna be, I want to watch it. I do know Shana Radford, and I do see the question about Shana Radford. And I think her role is going to be very critical, but I don't think you can put all of that responsibility into one person, because you do, again, have 9 tribes, and then you also have, you know, the urban community in Portland, and then you have Celilo Village, and so that's a lot to put on one person. She probably needs her own branch.
You know, she listed at the ATNI Summit, listed all of the things on her plate, and I was like, and your one one person was like, manage all relationships, come up with all the policies for. I was like, that seems like a very tall order. So I hear you. Well, and actually, one thing we've even, I will say, interfaced with a little bit too is, in addition to just the 9 federally recognized tribes in Oregon, and then those that are not necessarily federally recognized, and then those who have homelands that are in Oregon, like the Nez Perce tribe, not necessarily then having a seat, you know, specifically at the table with other, you know, particular decision making. So yeah, and actually we had another question that came through earlier that asked if you all do work or, you know, work to uplift those that are not necessarily federally recognized. So I feel like, Jalen, you answered that a little bit, but I don't know if you have anything more specifically on that in particular.
I think the only thing I would add is the neighboring tribes do try to support anybody really, you know, like Indian Health Services, you can be a descendant as long as you can prove descendancy, you get services there. And so I think there are ways that folks that don't come from a federally recognized tribe can be supported. And then you also have state recognized tribes, which we don't have that in Oregon, but you know, right across the way in Washington, they do. And so there's this different levels. But I think at least for Warm Springs, I can speak for Warm Springs. I know we're always trying to make sure that we're supporting Celilo Village. And that's why I was highlighting it, because we do try to send services and resources down to the village down there to provide, you know, because we know that they don't get the assistances that we get. And so we're able to provide that, not all the time, but you know, there are things that are happening to provide services and try to support folks that are not and you know, and respecting that they chose to not try to sign a treaty with the federal government because they didn't believe that they didn't want to give up their lands, they didn't want, you know, and so and you know, it came down to survival for many tribes to sign the treaties.
There's a question here. I think they're asking essentially the interplay between obviously tribes having their own government and then there's the government to government. And so just, you know, your role in ensuring fair representation in democracy. So I just how does that all get reconciled in your minds and in your work? Just the participating in American democracy governance and then the respecting government to government consultation relationship as sovereign nations. So that, if that makes sense, kind of a big question, but.
Dylan, you mind if I hop in and then you can complement what I say because you might have some better insights. I want to take an example, and that's with Deschutes County. What happened with they have some kind of resort out there, right? And there are issues with water, and it I can't remember all the specifics, but essentially, I think it went before the Oregon Land Use Board, where Warm Springs, the tribe, said, "Hey, this does not respect sovereignty. What's going on here?" And the Land Use Board said, "Nope, that's not valid." So now it's going to be going to the Supreme Court, best I can tell, right? So that whole scenario right there kind of illustrates why it's important for community members to understand what does sovereignty mean. It just isn't at the federal level, but this also in the interface between not just the state, but now we're talking about a county, right? And not recognizing this concept and what it means. And that's why these local elections are important, right? And this is why eventually we need to show, but like, hey, to protect your sovereignty, this is why voting, this is why the right electoral formats to where your vote has some sort of say. This is why all of this matters, if that makes sense. So as an organization, we're not there to address these issues quite yet. I think hopefully someday we're more equipped. But this just is in Central Oregon, the case in point on why these issues are so important. Even at the local level, there's clearly a huge gap and a lot of educational efforts that have to take place, right? So,
and I would just add another example is this movement around, I think it's Greater Idaho is what they're calling it, and I have not yet seen where they're acknowledging the tribal lands that they're trying to move into Idaho and our ceded lands is a lot of that. And there's been no discussion around them, like, not that I would encourage them to come and speak to my tribal nation. However, if they were following our structure of in trying to respect tribal sovereignty, they would be coming to consult with our tribe of like, we we want to move these lands that interlap over your ceded lands to Idaho. Like, that would be the appropriate response that they should be doing. And, of course, we're not going to support that. But I think that's another example of how even just a group should be also following and uplifting and centering our well, tribal consultation, I guess, and then making sure they're respecting tribal sovereignty.
That's an illuminating example. And yeah, I mean, in none of the media coverage did they talk about and what do the tribes of these places think about you just saying, and now we're just going to move half of Oregon into Idaho. Yeah, that's a great example. Somewhat related to this, so one person asked, are tribes able to, leverage their presence in decisions which impact their accessibility and health of lands, forests, waters, flora, and fauna? So I think they're trying to see, in your experience, are tribes, do they have a seat at the table when it comes to, land management and forest and waters and wildlife and all the things of the like? I don't know if either of you are able to answer that one.
So, it's interesting because this kind of goes into what was the legislation that was passed with the Oregon Land Use Board just this past, and I'm going to let Jalen have her thoughts on that process, and then I can pipe in. I think it's more appropriate as someone from one of the tribes affected to talk about this, and then I can kind of pipe in maybe my thoughts on it. So,
Are you talking about the email I sent? Is this?
yeah. So, sorry, Dan, what was the legislation that just got passed this last time around? HB, is it 30? Now,
I can't.
essentially there can be better representation on boards, more of an effort.
Oh,
And it goes back to, I think, the concept that we are pushing with redistricting reform. Let's just put it that way, where tribal input at a minimum, right? And it's not to say you can coordinate 9 tribes to select a commissioner on any commission. That's very tough to do, and there are problems with that. But there should at least be the option, right? And it should be left open to where that should be the goal. But there are a number of different things that folks can work on. I think it's really important to understand a lot of tribal governments have a lot on their plate with very limited resources. So I hear a lot of like, oh, well, folks, they should just figure this out if they really want a seat at the table. And they just don't get it because you look at what on these tribal councils, what folks are doing, basically working full time. They don't have staffers like a legislature does, right? They're doing everything on their own. So when they're getting hit by everything, there are not enough resources and there's no capacity. So I think that needs to be understood, and that's just what I've been noticing. And I bet Jalen can comment way more on that than I can. So let's just understand that first off. So it really is on, and like I said, it's easy for me to say coming from my perspective, but I think we would hope it's incumbent on folks to push harder to recognize sovereignty, the consultation process, whatever that is, and to make the best effort possible in that direction. I think ideally commissioners are selected by tribes. I don't know how we get there. That's something that like that concept is what we're pushing for redistricting. I also think it's important when you're what's the difference between that and then just optics, right? Saying, oh, we're going to put commissioners on here who have knowledge of tribes, right? And then what does that mean? That's toothless. It means nothing. So any kind of commission that's set up like that, where it's basically for show, Let's pretend like we got the help of tribes. Maybe let's pit some tribes against each other. Let's work to manipulate tribes, right? This becomes very problematic and it actually causes a lot of damage. So anybody that's pushing that angle, they're actually doing the wrong thing. So
Yeah, and I'll just add to the question. I do think the tribes can and they have in certain areas leveraged their presence. And I mean, you see it sometimes. Like, I know there was like the whole thing with the Dutch Bros owner who was trying to do gaming machines, and then you just saw like six tribes come together and be like, nope, we don't approve that, and we don't support that, and we are against it as six tribes together. And and they were able to push that through and advocate for the best interest of tribes, with six tribes coming on together in unison. But that doesn't happen in every single one, and I think that's a learning moment for a lot of people to understand that you're working with 9 different tribal governments who have their own processes, who have their own ways of doing things, and our cultures aren't necessarily the same. Like, we might fit under the same umbrella, but we have our different ways of being and ways of our different values. They might be very similar, but again, different values and different structures. Like, my tribe, we have 3 chiefs that sit on our tribal council, and then we have 8 tribal councilmen that represent different districts within our reservation. But then you can go over to Umatilla, who has a business council and a general council, and they operate in a different way. And then you can go on over to Silet, who has a different way of operating with their leadership. And so every single nation is unique. And so I think there also has to be a learning curve in that, of understanding that every single one of the tribal nations is unique in the way that they operate. And so it is going to get sticky, and we're not always going to agree. I mean, you can see what's happening with the Willamette Falls. There's a lot of tension there with who's the owner, and also, like, I think that just goes against our beliefs of, like, we don't own the land. And so I think even that just argument is really harmful to the way that we were brought up, at least from my perspective as a tribal member.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I hear this all the time in policy, just saying Oregon tribes or the tribes, like it's a monolith, and that is just inherently very problematic. Um, and actually, and going to that first question I asked, I realized I think that person was referring perhaps to the bill that Representative Sanchez passed on creating a task force to lay out, some principles and guidelines around consultation and engagement with the Oregon tribe. So my guess is that's what that person was perhaps referring to. That is brand new, Jalen. So that's probably why it hasn't necessarily made its rounds. Just in the interest of time, it's 7:05, so I want to maybe give you guys each an opportunity to just wrap it up with final thoughts. But then we'll just kind of wrap it up from there. So, Jalen, I don't know if you want to go first, or Brian, but I'll leave it to you for any final thoughts. And thank you again for joining us with such busy schedules.
So like I said, we're brand new. We hit the ground running with a couple of projects, and we're finally getting into a good place. So our website, technically it's active, but you're going to see the social media website, all of this stuff with our projects and what we're doing in the community, but also at the state level. We'll be on the executive committee for ranked choice voting to help get that passed. Looking hard at proportional ranked choice voting, doing a lot of work with redistricting reform. But like I said, the big component is Jalen's work in the community. To us, that is the core of Tribal Democracy Project. And it all of that stuff, just stay tuned. Like I said, the website's active, but all the content is about to get landed on that. There is a website. It's tribaldemocracy.org. Right now there's a donor link, the most important part, so feel free to hop onto that. Yeah, so there's also contact info on there if anybody wants to get a hold of us. So
Yeah, thank you all for attending. Thank you for the invite. Again, I'm so sorry that I was late, but democracy in action. And I guess I'll just finish off with there's a lot of resources for folks to learn on your own. And I always recommend that. And, that's always my call to action of, we didn't even get to, I think, really hit on the land acknowledgement topic, but I would say, like, if you're going to offer land acknowledgements in the future, please make sure that, for one, it's respectful and that it includes everybody that it should in the respective area. But also, I always say, I think those aren't weighted if there's no call to action for people to actually take a step forward to actually be have some action in the movement. And so whether that's like sharing links to, I always I shouldn't be sharing this because Brian just said donate to ours. That's a great cause. But usually when because I've been asked to do land acknowledgements, I speak on land acknowledgements, and I actually call them territorial acknowledgements. But I always, say Choosh Fund, which is for Warm Springs, or the MBO Fund, which is for Klamath, and just that's a really good way. But also just, I think, building relationships with people and taking the step to learn things on your own is the best thing that we could do, because as you heard throughout, I think tonight, is we as tribal nations are doing what we can to make sure that we're educating ourselves on how this government operates, and we have to work within that system. It would be great that if everybody else was taking the time to be able to learn about tribal nations and their processes and procedures and their history, in order to make sure that when you are in your positions, that you can sit down and say, is this on tribal lands? Is this on ceded lands? Should we be including tribal nations? And most of the time, I would say, like, probably 99% of the time, you should be. And so that would be my ask to everybody tonight is, make sure you're taking that extra step, because we have to, as citizens of not only our tribal nations, but as this United States government, to have to learn both of those government structures. And so if we can all do that together, I think, as we're, there was questions in there about representatives and things like that. And yes, we want to put our own people in there, but that's not always the case. So when we have really good allies that are speaking up for our tribal nations, that's also a benefit for us. And so thank you all for your attention tonight and taking the time to be here with us. I really appreciate the invite.
Thank you both so much. And we definitely share out a lot of resources, at least that we've come across and that have been shared with us with colleagues and community partners. So we'll be sure when we send this webcast recording out that we share some of those resources. They're also on our website as well. So thank you so much, and have a good night, everybody. Thank you for joining. Bye.